All right, let's talk about sexuality during childhood and the teenage years. So we know from infancy that infants are sexual beings, although they don't have any comprehension of what sexuality is. Babies show the ability to have a sexual response as early as birth or even in utero, where there is evidence that infants masturbate in the uterus. So sexuality is a normal part of their behavior, but you have to recognize that they don't differentiate between sexuality and sensuality, which is the experience of the senses. When a little baby boy grabs his penis and messes around with it, he's not doing it because he's thinking, oh, masturbation, yay, this will be fun. It's just interesting. It's a new sensation, and it's a nice sensation, so that's just what he does. Now, as children get older, of course, we all stay as sexual beings, but it's taboo. It's taboo even for adults, and it's really weird to study sexuality in children, and people are uncomfortable with it, and so there's really not that much out there, which is unfortunate. We do know that there are some behaviors that are common by certain ages. At 2 to 3 years old, you can see masturbation become much more common than with younger children. 4 to 7 years old, sex play begins, and children can mimic actually having sex if they've seen it. They can mimic doing other, touching and other sorts of things that mimic sexuality. And again, this is particularly when they have been exposed to it in some way. So if you let your child watch porn, which some really screwed up parents do, and yes, I'm judging you if you do that, then they're much more likely to act this stuff out. But even if they haven't seen it, by 4 to 7 years old, they already have a basic understanding to some degree. And they might try, kissing a friend to see what it's like. Or, kids teach each other how to French kiss their hand and things like that. So that's really normal at this age. 5 to 7 years old, the marriage script enactment begins. So they start to pretend to get married and have weddings and all that fun stuff. 8 to 9 years old, we see a separation of the genders. So gender identification, it's a long process that starts at about 3 years old, when kids start to just basically understand the category, that I'm a boy or a girl, and then they fill in the details along the way. Now, early elementary school kids start to become much more rigid about their gender. It's called gender rigidity. And so boys only want boy stuff, and they want to play with boys, and girls just, to reinforce their gender so that they can understand it better. For a while, they become very gender rigid. And that's one reason why they play separately. That kind of decreases towards the end of the elementary school years, and then it increases again in high school. 10 to 11 years old, there is much more interest in bodily changes because, of course, they are heading towards puberty. So this is very common across the board. Now, we all know what puberty is. I'm not going to go into it too much, but around 8 to 14 years old, and 2 years earlier in girls, hormones are released, and the body begins, all the various changes. Guys grow a beard, their voice changes, they have more hair everywhere, their penis enlarges, girls grow their breasts and menstruate, lucky us. And then we all get acne, which sucks. But these are all just, a result of the hormonal changes. Now, psychologically, this has a major impact on mental health. So the earlier a boy goes through puberty, the more admired he is among his peer group. So a large, muscular, well-developed young kid is the leader of the boy club. And everybody looks up to him. He's awesome. Girls are more likely to like him than the scrawny little kids that haven't gone through puberty yet. And so it really is a boost to his mental health. On the other hand, the later a boy goes through puberty, the more likely he is to be picked on and bullied, and he's going to have more insecurities. He'll be bottom of the social order, and the boy world, the male world, period, is pretty tough on each other. A lot of teasing and so on, which is why a lot of men really emphasize toughening their boys up because the world is so hard, and the world of guys is pretty hard on each other. So that can be problematic. On the female side of the spectrum, the earlier a girl goes through puberty, the worse it is for her mental health. And that's because for some reason girls get teased for being more developed. So if they have breasts growing, if they have especially larger breasts, and that's the typical instigator of like the pubertal is that a word? Puberty-based changes. That I mean, there's not a lot more to indicate whether girls going through puberty, unless maybe she mentioned she started her period. But those things trigger teasing, and girls can tease just as harshly as the boys can beat each other up. So that's not good for girls. The later they go through puberty, the better it is for their mental health. So keep that in mind if you have kids, that it's something you might have to watch out for and consider and see how their peer group is treating them. And also with the environmental toxins that we have nowadays, it has actually increased, I don't know if that's the right word, not increased, but it's sped up puberty in girls. So girls have puberty earlier and earlier now because of like plastics in the environment and hormones in the food. Plastic releases what's called a xenoestrogen or foreign estrogen, and that can trigger puberty to happen earlier in little girls. I had a student once who came up to me and said, I don't know what to do. My daughter has started her period and I'm really freaking out about it. And I'm like, well, sweetie, I'm sorry, but that's what happens with little girls. And she goes, yeah, but she's 5 years old and she had started her period. That's insane. And that has to be from the exposure to environmental toxins. Boys are affected in the opposite way. So the more they are affected to these toxins, the more delayed their puberty is. And of course, we know that that causes mental health issues. So yeah, try to keep your kids away from plastics. Try to go organic. It actually is important, not just to physical development, but psychological development. I won't go through this too much. These are just the physical changes happening. So for girls, the vaginal walls become thicker, the uterus enlarges. You start to have vaginal secretions, which can be weird for girls. Menarche, which is just you started your period. On average, that's 12 to 13 for girls, as young as 5. And then for boys, of course, their prostate enlarges, their seminal vesicles enlarge, and they have their first ejaculation around 13. And like I said, these physical changes can be positive or they could be negative. And part of it is also the attitude of their support group. So when a girl starts her period, does it get made fun of? Is it kind of shameful? Is dad embarrassed about it and he refuses to go and pick her up pads from the store? Or like, for instance, I lived on the Navajo reservation for a year as part of my doctorate. And one of the things they do is they have a coming of age celebration. So when a girl gets her period, it is a big hoopla. It's like a sweet 16 party, and it is highly celebrated. It's a wonderful thing, and she's finally considered a woman. And so it's a big deal, and that's a wonderful thing to do. So consider for both your girls and your boys that you do something in order to celebrate or to mark this transition from childhood to adulthood. For girls, I think a celebration is great. Traditionally for boys, there's usually some challenge they're exposed to in order to kind of prove that they've become a man. And I think that's something that can be modernized and brought into, the American way of life. So just a thought for if you are raising your own children. Now, there is a sexual double standard. I don't think that surprises any of us. The permissiveness for men and women is different. Men, we kind of expect them to have sex. Women, it's more expected that they are virtuous and pure, and virginity is held up to, put on a pedestal. So obviously more restrictive for women. I don't know if that's bad that women are restricted so much. I mean, obviously it's been excessive throughout history, but we're kind of excessive in moving to the opposite at this point. But certainly for men, there should be a bit more restrictions, I think. So I don't know. Luckily, I'm not queen of the world, so I don't have to make these decisions. But I think it is something that as parents or potential future parents, that you might want to think about, and even for your own life, you might want to think about. So there's also different focuses for boys and girls. Girls focus more on the relationship, and they usually, when a teenage girl describes why she has sex, well, not just teenage, it's also pretty similar to adult women. It's because of love, because they wanted to deepen the relationship, and so on. It's not always the reason, but it is one of the top reasons. For boys, teenage boys, it's often more of a conquest. They often get patted on the back. They raise in social status once they have said that they've had sex. And for girls, typically the opposite happens. If a girl says that she has had sex, then the other girls look down on her, and it's kind of a mixed bag. On the one hand, there's some admiration, but she's also looked upon as a negative, kind of lower class girl, and that's sort of something women struggle with their whole life, that dilemma to appear sexy versus easy, the Madonna whore complex. So if you're into sex, you're bad. If you are pure, you're good. I think we can have a balance, but yeah, anyways, it's definitely something that affects our mental health. Right. Masturbation in teenage years, unsurprisingly, continues from childhood and increases in frequency, especially among boys. It is much more common than partnered sexual activity. In other words, your teenage child, or you as a teenager, was probably doing a lot more masturbating than actually having sex. Not really surprising, okay? It's a lot easier to have sex with yourself than somebody else. And it can also have benefits, right? It's something that has been looked down upon historically. We've talked about that. But it is also a potentially positive outlet for aggression, frustration. It can be relaxing, whatever, okay? Sexual expression. So there are positives to masturbation. A lot of people have hangups about it. You're just going to have to consider it and decide for yourself what your opinion is. So I won't go into that too much because we've already talked about it in a different chapter. Now, non-coital sexual expression. So not having actual sex, but still being sexual or doing sexual behaviors is very common among teenagers. So this includes kissing, holding hands, touching, manual or hand-based stimulation, oral stimulation of the genitals. And all of these are much more common nowadays than they would have been, 50 years or a century ago. Oral genital stimulation has increased among teenagers, so it is much more common to have oral sex. The attitude towards it has also changed, and teenagers are much more likely to report that oral sex is okay. And also to not consider oral sex actual sex, whereas I would say when I was a teenager, there was no differentiation. If you had oral sex, you had sex. Like, you were not a virgin anymore. Or at the very least, you were a very skanky girl. But anyhow, so a lot of people say it's a way where you can have sexual intimacy but maintain your virginity. And there is truth to that. I mean, if you see it differently. But unfortunately, there are negatives that come along with having oral sex. So physically, you can catch some diseases, herpes, okay? So you can get that. There are things that can go wrong physically with oral sex. So it is not the safest thing. As a matter of fact, they make condoms for oral sex to protect your mouth. So that shows you how potentially serious it is that you could catch certain types of STDs, or STIs, I guess they call them now. Don't know why they changed that. But psychologically, there are also outcomes to it. Teen sex, orally or vaginally, can have negative emotional consequences, particularly for girls. Although boys also report them, girls report negative emotional side effects more often. So there was a study that was done in California schools where they followed sexually active students, 56% of whom were girls, and all of them reported having vaginal and or oral sex by 10th grade. Okay, so this is starting fairly young. From the study, they found that overall the teens reported some positive consequences, obviously pleasure, popularity, particularly for the boys, stronger relationships, but a very sizable percentage also had reported negative consequences, such as they felt used, they got pregnant, they contracted a sexually transmitted disease, and just generally feeling bad about themselves after having the sex and or oral sex. So of those reporting at least one negative consequence, 31% of those had only oral sex, 58% had only vaginal sex, and of those who felt emotional negativity, 62% of those who reported it had oral and vaginal sex. Okay, so performing both actually slightly increased the negative repercussions of the sexual behavior. Now, girls were more than twice as likely as boys to feel bad about themselves after having sex, and girls were also more than 3 times as likely to say that they felt used after having the sex and or vaginal sex and or oral sex. And that's pretty consistent with research on teenage male sexuality. Boys, of course, have like the rise in popularity and so on that benefits them, whereas girls don't have that. On the other hand, boys were also more likely to report a pregnancy than girls were, and more likely to report a sexually transmitted infection than girls were. The researchers didn't really know the reasons for that, but it might be because the boys were generally more sexually active, they'd had more partners, and so therefore they were more likely to end up getting a girl pregnant. So definitely some ramifications for having sex. Okay. Now, an ongoing sexual relationship is much more common in the modern era than it has been in the past, unsurprisingly. So modern teens are more likely to be sexually intimate with someone they feel they love or feel emotionally attached. Whereas in the past, if you loved someone, you married them. You didn't just have sex, you actually got married. But the rates of marriage has dropped dramatically, and so we're not having sex, we're not having getting married as often, just having sex. And there's also, girls are less likely to save themselves for marriage, so the rate of virgins who get married has decreased from, let's see, I think it's 21%, like back in the 1950s, to like 5% nowadays for women. Boys, on the other hand, and this is a positive, they are more likely to want an affectionate relationship. So that's actually a good thing that came of it. Now, you might be curious, like how to keep your children from having sex. In the school system, we have abstinence programs and so on, and the research shows that it doesn't work that well. But there's a place called the Search Institute that researches what factors prevent children from, using drugs and alcohol, ending up in prison, having early teenage sex, becoming single moms, all of these negative factors that we hope our kids don't have to deal with eventually. And what they found is there are 40 developmental assets that significantly prevent children from eventually getting into these troubled behaviors. So I'll post this PDF on the website for you guys, but it classifies them into external and internal assets. So external is how does the world around you help or hinder, and internal is what is going on inside yourself that supports or detracts from your future. So for instance, family support. Life provides high levels of love and support. Positive family communication. Young person and her or his parents communicate positively, and young person is willing to seek advice and counsel from parents. Other adult relationships. A caring neighborhood, a caring school climate, parental involvement in schooling. In the empowerment sector, community values youth. Youth are viewed as resources. Service to others. Young person serves in the community 1 or more hours per week. So volunteer work. Safety. Young person feels safe at home, school, and in the neighborhood. Then you've got family boundaries, school boundaries, neighborhood boundaries, adult role models, positive peer influences, high expectations. which is interesting because there's a movement in parenting where you shouldn't expect things from your child. You should just allow them to develop who they are. The research does not support that. As my mama said, you're going to college. You just need to decide if you're going to go to graduate school or not, because college isn't even, that's not even on the table. You're doing college. You're graduating. So you just have to decide if you want a master's or a doctorate. And I got a doctorate. Creative activities. A young person spends 3 or more hours per week in lessons or practice in music, theater, or other arts. Not sports, arts. Sports are important too, but the arts are extremely important. Youth programs, this would be sports. Spends 3 or more hours per week in sports, clubs, or organizations at school or in the community. Religious community. Young person spends 1 or more hours per week in activities in a religious institution. Time at home. Young person is out with friends with nothing special to do 2 or fewer nights per week. Okay, those are external things that can be done that research has shown in multiple studies will decrease the chances of children ending up doing risky, bad behaviors, such as having sex at a young age and possibly ending up pregnant or with a sexually transmitted disease. And I will also point out that there are all sorts of negative ramifications for early sex. The earlier a kid has sex, the more likely they are to be raped, the more likely they are to end up divorced, the more likely they are to end up in jail, on drugs and alcohol. So you do not want your child having sex early. Our society sings the praises of sex, and we should all be sexually active, and we should be doing it as often as we can with as many people as we want, and human or animal or whatever. Yes, there's actually a movement to legalize having sex with animals. So it's not actually good for you, okay? There's a lot of research showing all of the consequences of that type of sexuality. So anyhow, then we have the internal assets. I won't go through all of them, but achievement, motivation, they want to do well in school, school engagement, homework. They spend at least 1 hour every single school day doing their homework. Reading for pleasure. You guys don't do that often enough. Young person reads for pleasure 3 or more hours per week. Make your kids read books. Read books yourself. You're much more likely to succeed in every area of life if you are a book reader. Okay, so you can look through all this stuff, but a lot of it's common sense, but on the other hand, the fact that it is supported by so many research articles out there really shows that you've got to take this stuff seriously. Now, other risky behaviors, teen sexting, sending sexually suggestive or explicit photos or text messages. This is becoming much more common, and oftentimes it's not between 2 teenagers, it's an adult and a teenager, which is gross and not problematic in so many ways. But if your child is sexting, they're much more likely to have sex. They're much more likely to end up as a pregnant teenager and to have all sorts of problems. And as my mama always said, you never take sexual photos because you never know where they will end up. And there are so many horror stories out there of these poor young kids who end up with their nude photos plastered all over the internet and having all sorts of bullying and crap happening. So yeah, that's really bad, which is why I don't think you should give your child a cell phone, including your teenager. I had my first cell phone when I was like 24, and I'm happy for that. So happy. I did not grow up with cell phones, and there's no way I would. When you are out of my house and paying your own bills, you're welcome to get a cell phone. Okay. Yes, that's how I am. So sexual intercourse itself. I think we know what all this stuff is. Premarital sex, sex before marriage, adolescent coitus, sex when you're a teenager. So one of the interesting statistics is that the upward trend or the increasing rates of teen sex has leveled off somewhat. There's actually some movements out there, like a chastity movement and so on, where teens are seeing the repercussions of sexuality. And just like divorce, sexual permissiveness comes and goes in waves. So you'll have one generation that is very sexually permissive, and the next generation sees that and sees the consequences of it, and then they become much more sexually conservative. And then the next generation grows up without seeing the consequences of sexual permissiveness, and then they become sexually permissive, and it bounces back and forth. And the same thing happens with divorce. So for instance, my generation, which is millennials, I'm like technically Xennial, so I come right after Generation X, and it's kind of like a, I don't know, boundary generation, subgeneration. And so, but millennials, period, including Xennials, but especially Xennials, don't get married. So of my subgeneration, Xennials, only 25% of us are married. That's it, which is really, really low rate for marriage. But we were raised by like the baby boomers and older generation Xers, and who had the worst, like the worst divorce rates our country has ever seen was in the 1980s, which is when the Xennials were born. I was born in 1981. And so when we grew up, we went, I'm not getting married. Are you kidding? If I marry someone, I am not marrying someone that I'm going to divorce. It's like the emotional hang up that our parents' generation gave to our generation. And that has been seen, throughout the history of divorce, that you have one generation with high divorce rates, the next generation with low divorce rates, and it goes back and forth. Interestingly, over time, that effect has been decreasing somewhat, but we're not seeing that with sexuality. That still remains a very distinct and strong effect of the opposite generations. All right. Reasons for engaging in teenage sex. I mean, some of these are so obvious. I hate when textbooks are this obvious. But one of the things I will point out is that teenagers are so much more adult-like now than when I was a kid or when even older generations were children. Like I look at, senior portraits or, pictures of that kids take, and like nobody wore makeup. The most makeup anybody wore was like mascara. And then there was a lot of Mexicans at the school that I went to, and so there was some of that, LA, like the dark lipstick around the edge of the lips and everything. But that, I'm like, that was the most. And it was kind of the grunge era, and nobody looked like a sexy adult in the late 90s when I went to school. But nowadays, it's like you see a kid in 6th grade or 5th grade, and they totally look like they're totally sexualized. It's insane. I look at the senior portraits and I'm like, that's not what we looked like in school. Like my pictures when I was a senior in high school, I don't like to look at them. They're embarrassing and they're so childlike. I'd love to have senior portraits like kids have nowadays. But the problem with that is that children are so sexualized so early that they start to participate in actual sex at a much younger age. There are a lot more repercussions to having teenage sex than there are to having nerdy senior photos. Okay, so what causes teenagers to have sex early? So we talked about some of the protective factors with the developmental assets list, but some of the risk factors are a family that lives in poverty and family conflict. Those are the two biggest factors in whether a child will end up having sex early as a teenager. And I would say, and I think the research supports this, that family conflict is a bigger predictive factor than poverty. Because really, why does a teenager have sex, or why does anybody have sex? Because you're reaching out for support and relationship. And when you're doing it young, it's because you may not have that at home. Other predisposing factors, parental lack of education, lack of supervision, hence that developmental asset that said your kid doesn't just go ahead and hang out in the neighborhood doing nothing, and also substance abuse. Okay. Some other protective factors, and I think all of these were mentioned in the 40 developmental assets. Strong religious beliefs, the number one predictor of delayed sexuality, or well, maybe I should say normal, healthy sexuality in our modern culture. So you take your kid to church, you have, some faith belief, then your child is much less likely to have sex as a teenager. If they do well in school, they're much less likely to have sex. If you are higher socioeconomic status, they're much less likely to have sex early. And then I think this is as equally as important as strong religious beliefs. I'll have to double check, but I'm pretty sure those had basically the same effect, was a high quality parent-child relationship and communication. So if your child feels like they have a good relationship with you, and particularly dad, that's actually the relationship with dad is even more important to a girl than the relationship with mom when it comes to preventing teenage sex. So yeah, you're important, men. You are important. Okay, I think we've talked about most of this. Cloud going over. Homosexuality. So there's so little research on homosexuality out there. Let me change this. Yeah, there's so little research on homosexuality out there, and it's terrible. You know, no matter what the research says, it's so helpful to know what is truly going on. And we just don't do the research because if the researchers say anything that's considered negative about homosexuals, then they lose their funding, they lose their job, they get death threats. I mean, it's so, I don't know if emotional is the word to use. It's so controversial that researchers just don't want to do the research. So not a lot has been done. So some individuals begin to self-identify as a lesbian, gay, or bisexual, or asexual, or all of the millions of things out there now in the teenage years. Many people report feeling that way earlier than the teenage years, but the vast majority in the teenage years start to feel this way, which makes sense because the teenage years are about relationships. It is about sexuality, so it makes sense. And of course, if you come out as homosexual, then there are many times severe negative social reactions to that. Which I don't care what your feeling is towards homosexuality, whether you believe it's a sin or whether you believe it's awesome, the way people are treated, like I don't care. Like I work with domestic violence offenders and I believe they should be treated with love and respect at all times, even though they've beat the crap out of their wife or their girlfriend or stabbed her or whatever. I mean, some of the things they do are horrible and it does not matter. They should be treated with love and respect. So the process of reconciling their sexuality with the expectations can be difficult. Religious homes do often experience more intense problems, although there is research that shows, I'm fixing this because of those clouds, that many more religious households show support towards homosexuals than secular households. So it kind of goes on both extremes. So if it's bad, it's really bad. But otherwise, it actually can go over fairly well. And there's that love and respect and support. Of course, again, everything in psychology is a generality. So your experience may be different, but that's what the research says. Okay, many are, of course, unable to talk openly with their parents, which I think is sad. But yeah, there's not a lot else to say about this because there's so few research that has been done. Some of the research shows that, or suggests that people who are homosexual have more issues with their same-sex parents, whether that's a trigger of homosexuality or it is a repercussion of homosexuality. We have no idea. It's just associated. There is research that shows that girls who are raised by homosexual fathers are more distant and have a harder time having relationships than girls raised by a heterosexual couple. Just trying to think of all the research that's out there, and unfortunately, there's just not much. So, yeah, it's an unfortunate thing. All right, so of course, teenagers are having sex. We've got to talk about STDs. Now, when I was a kid, it was the AIDS epidemic. When my mom was a kid, it just wasn't talked about because, I mean, obviously STDs were out there, but they have become rampant since like the 60s on when sexuality became so permissive and common. Now, teenagers fall prey to the personal fable, which is nothing bad can happen to me. Teens feel that stronger than other ages, but I can assure you that that's how everyone feels. Oh, there are a lot of clouds going over. Change this again. Well, I'll probably have to keep changing it back and forth. Put it on automatic soon if it doesn't fix it. Where am I at? So obviously, if you believe that you couldn't catch a disease, you are more likely to act in a risky way. sort of like what's going on with coronavirus right now. Nobody believes that it's that big of a deal. And so everybody is engaging, well, not everybody, but a lot of people are engaging in risky behavior, not wearing masks, not social distancing, and so on. So, of course, you're more likely to catch it. So, teenagers also tend to view condoms as more of a form of birth control than as a protection from sexually transmitted diseases, and they just tend to not like to use them. Some believe they are already adequately protected from an unwanted pregnancy for whatever various reasons, but the truth is that nothing except for abstinence is 100% effective. And even Mary didn't have sex and still got pregnant, so that's not even 100% effective. But condoms don't work that great, especially for teenagers. So the statistics for condoms, I think, is like somewhere around 95% effective in preventing you from getting pregnant. And those statistics were taken from brothels in Nevada. So these are professional working prostitutes who are handling condoms and other things multiple times a day. And so they have a lot of experience, and they have a fresh source of condoms. So these are not condoms that have been sitting in your wallet for the past 3 years waiting to be used and getting old and fragile so that it breaks when you use it and don't want it to break. So when a teenager uses a condom, the success rate drops down somewhere to like 20%. That's it. So the chances of getting pregnant, you've got an 80% chance of getting pregnant. If you use a condom, that's not good. That's really bad. Okay, and obviously, if it's not working for pregnancy, it's not working for diseases. So, not good. Okay, teenage birth rates in the U.S. have declined, mostly because of abortions, which is also something that has a lot of negative repercussions, especially for teenagers. Abortion is hard on anyone mentally, and if it's not hard on you, that's worrisome. But anyhow, it's a lot of women have depression and anxiety and regrets and so on, which sucks. But teenagers in particularly are strongly affected by having to go through something like this, especially because they don't usually have any support. It's secret, they're ashamed. Sometimes the schools take them to get abortion, which I think is horrid, and they don't tell their parents. So really, really bad. Some negative consequences of teenage pregnancy. Teens are more likely to have physical complications. Babies are more likely to die with a teen mother. They're more at risk for infections, sexually transmitted infections, which means the baby's more at risk. Pregnant teens are less likely to go on to college. They're less likely to make a good income. And of course, they're more likely to be bad parents. Again, generalities. There are some teenagers out there who are rocking it. But overall, in our modern society, teenage pregnancy does not go well. Now, centuries ago, it would be normal for you to get pregnant as a teen, and there would not have been some of these repercussions because socially it was accepted that you get pregnant at that age. So there would have been support for you in your young pregnancy. Now, of course, things like the physical complications would have still existed. Contraceptives, so teens are much less likely to use contraceptives. They're much less likely to use them consistently or correctly. For instance, if you take birth control pills, it can take months for you to get regulated with birth control pills. Sometimes they don't work for you. Sometimes they make you sick, and so you have to change the brand. Sometimes, you'll take them in your period. You have a breakthrough period when you shouldn't be having a period. And so it's not as easy as the commercials make it sound. You don't just pop the pill and you're good to go. And also, if you skip a day, if you get sick, birth control pills can stop working. If you get stressed out, they can stop working. And so it does not work as well as it is supposed to. Now, how do we reduce teen pregnancy? My opinion is you look at the research. Change this camera again. And the research shows that those developmental assets are the most effective. So programs should, in my opinion, in the researcher's opinion, should center around those 40 developmental assets, but they don't often do that. So one way is free confidential contraceptive services, so sneaking your teenager birth control pills without parents' permission, sex education, which has not been shown to decrease teenage pregnancy. It also doesn't increase teenage pregnancy, so it's not necessarily bad, but it's not super helpful for that either. Making condoms available, which has also not been shown to be successful because kids don't usually use condoms correctly. And then increasing adolescent parent communication about sex, which can be helpful, but it's probably not as helpful as just creating a good relationship between the teenager and their parent. All right. Okay, so how do you talk to your child about sex? My mom says that I talked to her about sex when I was like in kindergarten. My little sister, so she was even younger, like preschool. My little sister and I came up to her one day and said, "Mom, how are babies made?" Now, my mom has a PhD in fetal physiology, so she always says that she studies everything from the waist down. That's her specialty. So for her, like, sex, it wasn't that big of a deal to talk about, although she said she still had a little mini freak out, but she just didn't let us know. So all she did was she took out like one of those yellow pads of paper and she drew the uterus and said, "So this is inside your belly, and when mom and dad love each other, they do something called having sex, and which is something that feels good, but you shouldn't do until you're married. And when they do that, then it releases an egg, like a chicken egg, and it releases this little thing called a sperm, and they meet up, and when they meet up, a baby begins to grow. And then that grows in mom's belly for the next 9 months, and then you come out and you have a baby." And we went, "Okay," and we went and ran away and played. And that was the only sex talk she ever gave us. Now, the next thing she did was when we were in about, I think, 6th grade, she gave us romance novels to read. So we got a thorough sex education long before the public school system ever gave us boring diagrams where we had to write out what this was the scrotum and this was that and so on. So if you want your child to have an excellent sex education, then give them a romance novel to read because it's pretty juicy. Now, a lot of people don't like romance novels because they think that it sensationalizes romance and gives women like unrealistic ideas. And I think that was probably true with romance novels like back from the 60s and 70s. Because I've looked at those and it's just like, it's so corny. But the romance novels my mom gave us to read were what's called a historical romance novel. So they're based in like a certain period of time in history and, some event like the Civil War or the French Revolution. And historical romance novels tend to be extremely historically accurate because, I don't know, the fans, I guess, are obsessive about it. And so I can swear to you that I learned way more about history from reading romance novels than I ever learned in the California educational system. So there's some double benefits to that. All right, so now how you talk about sex with a kid, you're welcome to do it however you want. I don't believe there's any research that shows the most effective way to do it. But talking straightforward with your kids, especially when they're older, can be really awkward and uncomfortable for the child as well as the parent. So I believe if you're going to have the talk with your kid, that the earlier you start, the more normal it feels to the kids, and it's just not that big of a deal for them. And then later on, they're probably more likely to talk openly about sex with their parents. Okay, guys, so slumber party time with your teacher. I bet you've never had a professor lecture to you in their PJs. But I was just laying here painting my nails, which I noticed looked pretty freaking awful in the video. And I watched the documentary Childhood 2.0, and I can't even begin to tell you how absolutely horrified I was about the situation with social media and kids in Generation Z and below. So I felt really naive about my lecture, talking about sexting and what children are exposed to nowadays and all of that stuff. And I realized my lecture doesn't even begin to touch on what the reality is of what you young people are going through. I mean, when I grew up, The 1980s was like the height of the drug problem in the United States, more divorce than any time in the country's history, the world's history. There was more crime than there had been in at least a century at that time. I think the 1940s or the 1950s was the lowest crime rate that the world had seen, and or the United States had seen, and it just basically skyrocketed up from the 50s, and then it peaked in the 80s during my childhood. And even when I was a kid, your parents were just, get out of the house. Now, the crime rate has dropped dramatically to the point where it is safer today than it was back in the 1950s, which is the safest time period in U.S. history. And yet, we are so paranoid about something happening to our kids that you Generation Z guys and below, like anybody lower than millennials or even young millennials, you guys were never allowed out of the house. The world is a dangerous, scary place. You're going to get raped, whatever. So you have no opportunity to decompress. And that part of it, I get. Like, I get part of why you guys are always so stressed out and so much anxiety. Like, I have never had so many students complain about their mental health. And I just thought it was the whole millennial generation touchy-feeliness that has just kind of skyrocketed on steroids to the sensitive little Generation Z students. And I'm not saying that to be mean about it or anything, but just to explain how I had no idea what that generation and the next generation is going through. And the part that I didn't understand was the way you guys use social media. And so I'm assigning this documentary for you guys' discussion board this week because it floored me. It brought me to tears to see the way that your generation has been abused by social media. When I was just saying this to my sister the other day, that when I got on Facebook for the first time, it was in 2010, and I think it was like 5 years old at the time. And it was a fun place to be. Like, people were nice. People were supportive. It was just a place to go to share some pictures with friends and to be able to catch up. And now it's just like a shark fest. And evidently that's what your guys' life has been like. Constant cyberbullying, and the percentage of like kids who are looking at pornography, like, I guess even like little kids are watching pornography on their phones and being hit on by pedophiles. And I mean, it's just like, I can't even explain the video. For you younger people, you probably know what I'm talking about, but for anybody my age and above, you literally have no idea what I'm talking about right now. But it's horrifying, and so that's why I am assigning that video for you to watch. Trying to express the way it made me feel, but it's like your childhood has been stolen. I had a wonderful childhood, riding bikes around the town, and not just down the street, or in front of my house, miles away. I'd go to the local Kmart or whatever, and my sisters and I would buy candy, and that was like 10 miles away. And our parents had no idea where we are all day. And it was a wonderful way to grow up. But for you guys to live in that amount of fear and exposed to the things that you're exposed to, it just really explained a lot to me. For instance, I was getting really irritated at some of my classes because I had probably had 15 students email me and say that they missed the exam because most of the reasoning was anxiety. I was feeling really depressed, and I had to take some time to take care of myself, or a friend of mine committed suicide last year and I couldn't handle it, or just all of these reasons. And I'm like, come on, like, get over it. Like, everybody has a tough life, but you're ruining your future by giving into these emotions. But then I watched that video and I'm like, well, no wonder you guys, you have all of these horrendous stressors that no generation has ever dealt with before. I mean, you couldn't get pornography when I was in elementary school or junior high. I didn't even know anybody who watched or at least admitted to watching pornography in high school or even college. Like, if you watched it, you certainly didn't tell anybody. And now it's just it's just normal. And little kids are watching pornography. And after I watched this documentary, I've been Googling and doing some research, and it's so commonplace. And the pedophiles and I mean, you guys have all been trained that the real world out there is so dangerous, but it's not. What's dangerous is the internet. And I can tell you, if I had children, they would not have cell phones or iPads or any access to the internet because it's not safe. That's what the dangerous world is. And the rates of suicide and depression and anxiety, I mean, it is ruining your guys' life. And I guess that's really what I wanted to say with this footnote to the lecture, is that you are the only person who's going to take control of your life. Your parents won't do it. I don't know why, but I don't know. My generation, who's probably your guys' parents, maybe some Generation Xers, but we've all been trained that we should, like, your happiness is priority, and we can't take things away from you and upset you, and we have to candy coat everything for you. And so they can't do it. They can't take the phones away from you. They can't cut you off from the internet. But you need to take responsibility for your own life because it's ruining you guys. I mean, I thought the millennials were a screwed up generation, but the mental health issues, I mean, the millennials are just spoiled. But if you want to destroy somebody's soul due to the person, what the world is doing to Generation Z kids and below, it is so unhealthy for you. So anyhow, I know I'm rambling about this, but it just really affected me to see what you guys were dealing with. And I just wanted to tell you that throw away your cell phones, delete your Facebook accounts. You will be able to concentrate. You can focus better. I mean, you guys all think you're stupid. I hear it all the time. I'm a bad student. I can't handle this. I just can't do it. And the truth is that the internet is rotting your brain, and not to mention your soul. All sorts of studies have been done to show that the more time you spend on the internet, the less you can focus, the less you can concentrate on things, and the less you can read. Because the internet trains us to skim instead of to read deeply. And that's just the academic side of it. And when you talk about the emotional, psychological impact that this is having on you guys, I mean, us older people, this is not what we go through on the internet. Like, occasionally somebody says something nasty to you, and you delete it or block them, and that's kind of the end of it for us older generation people. But what you guys are going through is unique, and it's unhealthy, and just want to say to you, change your life, okay? Get rid of it. Just get rid of it, and your life will be so much better. So anyhow, I'm really interested in hearing what your responses are on the discussion board after you watch the documentary. Let me know if that is your experience, if you are a Generation Zer, or if you had a different experience, and if you are an older generation like me, let me know if this surprises you, or if you have also experienced this with your children or even with yourself. All right, talk to you guys later. Good night.